Hello, welcome to Module 2 on out-of-school suspension. In this module, we'll discuss two studies that were conducted about the relationship between out-of-school suspension, child welfare, and other variables. The first study we will discuss investigated the risk factors for out-of-school suspension. What puts students at higher risk for being suspended? And the second study investigated the outcomes of out-of-school suspension. After students are suspended, what other outcomes are they more likely to experience? Study number 1, Indigenous heritage, child welfare involvement, and the risk of out-of-school suspension. In the last module, we discussed disproportionalities in school discipline. One group of students who are suspended more often than their peers are Indigenous students in the United States. However, few studies had previously looked into this disparity, and many studies of out-of-school suspension do not include Indigenous children as a distinct group. Indigenous students being treated harshly in schools has a long history in the United States, going back to the practice of Native American boarding schools, wherein Indigenous children were displaced from their families and homes with the goal of assimilating them to white settler culture. These children were often treated harshly and abused, as well as not being allowed to continue their family's cultural practices or speak their native languages. In addition, there is a history of documented disparities in the child welfare system when it comes to the Indigenous communities in the United States. Indigenous families are overrepresented in the child welfare system, and Indigenous children are vastly overrepresented in out of home placements. These disparities persist despite ICWA, a policy that was passed in an attempt to reduce the disparities experienced by Indigenous families in the U.S. child welfare system. The sample for this study was 60,025 students who were enrolled in Minnesota public schools in third grade in 2008. This graph shows the number of students who are identified in the data as white, Black, Latinx, Asian, or Indigenous. It also shows the proportion of each group who experienced out-of-home care. As you can see, a disproportionate percentage of Indigenous students experienced out-of-home care, more than twice the number of Latinx and Asian students who experienced out-of-home care, despite being a much smaller group than either. This study found that Indigenous students and Black students were disproportionately likely to have had reports of alleged maltreatment in their families and to experience out-of-school suspension. In addition, among students who had experienced reports of child maltreatment, while Indigenous students were more likely to be suspended than white students, this difference decreased and became insignificant at higher numbers of reports of child maltreatment. This could indicate that something other than the trauma caused by actual maltreatment could be a factor in the relationship between alleged maltreatment reports and out of school suspension among Indigenous students, since other studies have shown that Indigenous families are not more likely to maltreat their children than white families. Rather, systemic racism and bias in the child welfare system and in schools may contribute to these disparities. These findings point to the need to reduce disparities in school discipline and to move away from the practice of exclusionary discipline altogether. The overrepresentation of Indigenous families in the child welfare system and in out of home placement in particular is also an issue that needs to be targeted by leadership in Indigenous communities and in child welfare who are committed to anti racism and decolonization. It is important that social workers in general and child welfare professionals are aware of the effects of historical trauma and the ongoing traumas of systemic racism when working with Indigenous families. Study number 2, outcomes of out of school suspension for child welfare system involved children and others. In the last module, we learned that out of school suspension is associated with negative academic, health, and justice system related outcomes. The second study looked more in depth at the associations of child welfare with these outcomes. Another important foundational idea to be aware of for this study is labeling theory. That is, out of school suspension is associated with a student being labeled as quote unquote bad by their peers and teachers, which leads to further misbehavior and other negative outcomes when students internalize that label. The sample for this study was 55,925 students who were enrolled in third grade in 2008 in Minnesota public schools. 1,510 of those students had experienced out of school suspension. 116 had 3 or more Child Protective Services records, and 350 had experienced congregate care. On the left is a graph of the sample demographics in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and indigeneity. The study found that students who experienced out of school suspension at a young age had negative outcomes later on in their school career, poorer academic performance on math and reading standardized tests, and higher chances of being involved in the juvenile justice system. Congregate care was also associated with these negative academic outcomes, although there did not appear to be a compounding effect of this child welfare system involvement and out of school suspension on any of the outcomes in this particular study. However, out of school suspension did appear to amplify Black students' risk of juvenile justice system involvement, consistent with the school prison nexus theory that we discussed in Module 1. In addition, for students who were identified in the data as having emotional or behavioral disabilities, these disabilities did not increase the risk of juvenile justice system involvement in the sample overall. But for students who experienced out of school suspension, the risk of juvenile justice system involvement did increase among students with emotional or behavioral disabilities. In addition, this study provided evidence that negative outcomes of out of school suspension still disproportionately affected Black and Indigenous students, even when severity of the disciplinary incident was accounted for. In fact, severity of the disciplinary incident did not affect academic outcomes significantly. This supports the idea that systemic issues beyond individual student behavior contribute to suspensions and the outcomes of exclusionary discipline. Overall, this study supports the idea that students of color, particularly Black and Indigenous students, are at a higher risk of the negative outcomes of out of school suspension, especially compared to white students. In addition, child welfare system involvement, specifically congregate care, also puts children at risk for the negative outcomes of out of school suspension. The fact that out of school suspension amplifies Black students' risk, as well as the risk of students with disabilities, for juvenile justice system involvement, supports the school prison nexus theory that we discussed in Module 1. Exclusionary discipline is a key contributor to the school prison nexus, so moving away from these types of discipline strategies may help disrupt the school prison nexus. In addition, out of school suspension results in academic performance suffering in children who are already at risk, such as those who have a history of congregate care or are at a lower socioeconomic status. Now we'll review what we've just learned in this module. Like the last module, I'm going to ask you some basic questions about what we just learned, and then I'll ask you to journal your thoughts or discuss with someone else. What did Study 1 find about the risk factors of out of school suspension? What did Study 1 find about the relationship between Indigenous students' risk for out of school suspension and Child Protective Services involvement? What did Study 2 find about the outcomes of out of school suspension? What did Study 2 find about the relationship between Black students' risk for juvenile justice system involvement and out of school suspension? What did Study 2 find about the relationship between disabled students' risk for juvenile justice system involvement and out of school suspension? Now for some questions to prompt further thinking and discussion. You can pause the video after each question and either free write for a couple of minutes or discuss with a friend or colleague if you're completing this module with someone else. What is the relevance of the history of Native American boarding schools in the U.S. to the disproportionalities seen in the child welfare system today? Why do you think ICWA has not resolved the disproportionate involvement of Indigenous families in the child welfare system? Why do you think out of school suspension increases the risk for juvenile justice system involvement among Black students and students with disabilities? Why do you think children who have experienced congregate care are at an increased risk for poorer academic outcomes and juvenile justice system involvement? Thank you for participating in this module. The next module will be focused on how you can apply what you just learned to your own practice and exploring your role in taking action on these issues. And here are references.